The A80K is another fantastic OLED from Sony. This is their mainstream line OLED for 2022, coming in at 55, 65, and 77 inches. It is using LG Display's latest 2022 OLED module, at least in all of the ones that I have seen or have heard from. This panel is the replacement of last year's A80J, and in a moment we will discuss the changes that have been made. But first I do want to just stress that this is a fantastic looking TV. There's not a whole lot to complain about with it, and when pitted against the 77-inch LG G2, which has a heatsink and is a higher class of TV to compare it against, most of the time it looks very similar. So I will have another dedicated video comparing them side by side and going over their differences, but do know that it competes well. Now, when it comes to the TV itself, it's still using the MediaTek chipset from last year, so we are stuck with two HDMI 2.1 ports, being port 3 and 4, and we still have the same limitation where port 3 is also the eARC port. So if you have a soundbar or older receiver that doesn't have HDMI 2.1 in on it, then you are going to give up one of those ports for your sound system. Speaking of sound, the A80K over last year, one of the main marketing points for this model is the change in its sound and how you can connect it as a center channel to your sound system just like last year, but they made some refinements to make the sound more like a center channel. However, personally, I feel that it now has less bass than the A80J last year. The dialogue, especially of actresses, is more clear and can get a bit louder. However, deeper voices or anything with a little bass, let's say under 200 hertz or so, does not seem to be as strong as on the A80J, also at 77 inches, which I owned last year. However, audio is very subjective, so you may prefer this, and again, it just seems to be more dialogue focused and a little more focused on using it as a center channel. But if you are someone who's going to use it standalone by itself, which I wouldn't recommend, but if you do, it's fine for just about most things short of blockbuster movies. Moving on from audio, when it comes to processing, it's still the same excellent XR processor from last year. Motion and clarity, gradation handling, everything like that is still great. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. HDR and HDR highlights are still pretty much about the same as the 77-inch A80J last year or any A80J that had the newer WBE style panel in it. Last year, the 55 and 65-inch models, it was a panel lottery, so some of them had the older WBC panels and did not get as bright as the WBE panels because Sony did not put any kind of software restriction on the ones with the newer panels, so they were able to get a bit brighter than the ones with the older panels. So, if you're comparing an A80K that now has all new panels against an A80J from last year that had the older panel, there's a pretty decent upgrade there. Certainly measurable, certainly visible in the right kind of content. However, if you're comparing against an A80J with a WBE panel, that's not quite the case. It's actually very similar and in a way kind of a bit of a backstep because the A80J with the WBE panel could reach a higher APL or average picture level brightness and had a bit more relaxed ABL or automatic brightness limiter. The A80K seems to be a little bit more reined in, a little bit more conservative because last year those panels did also have an issue with image retention. Now there still is image retention on the A80K, though it does seem to not be quite as bad as last year, but it's still certainly there. I would say it's about a half step better with image retention, but at the same time, the only time that really matters is if you were to have the same thing on the screen for an extended period of time, like say you pause and go to the bathroom, get a drink, you come back, you press play, then you might have that image on screen for the next 30 seconds. Or if you're in a video game and you open a menu or look at something that's on the screen for 30 seconds to a minute, it could leave an afterglow or image retention. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. It depends on how bright the object was, how long it was on screen, etc. So anyway, there is a little bit of reduced brightness on the A80K when compared to the WBE A80J, but that's mostly in full field or larger window sizes, which does affect, again, the APL or average picture level brightness, whereas the highlight brightness is roughly the same as last year. Though this really isn't anything to be concerned too much about, as unless you have them side by side, you're really not going to notice. It's a difference of around 133 nits full field on the A80K to about 155 or so, maybe 160 at most full field on the A80J. So in reality, if they were next to each other and it was a very bright outdoor scene, then you could see the difference. But other than that, you really wouldn't most of the time. And if you are comparing to one of the A80Js with the older panel, those were not as bright, so it would be brighter than one of those. So expect a lot of other reviews to be talking about how it has gotten brighter as they compare to the smaller size panels that had the older WBC panels in them at launch period. Now, at this point in time, if there is still A80J stock, you can fully expect those to be all new panels at this point, even using the same 2022 panel module that the A80K uses most of the time, just because that's what's available at this point in time now. Alright, so moving on from that, if we go to Dolby Vision, it's still pretty much the same situation as last year if you are using the accurate Dolby Vision Dark Picture mode with its accurate Expert 1 or Expert 2 color temperature. Then there is a white point or color temperature shift compared to your other content, so that can be a little off-putting to have your Sdr and Hdr content have one white point or color temperature, and then your Dolby Vision content has another. So that is something Sony is still doing. And as far as out-of-the-box white point, it's still where it could either be Judd, it could be a different white point that Sony has been using on some of the panels. It just is, again, panel lottery slash panel variance. Just depends which line they come off of at the factory. Who knows? But there is a couple different white points that they can be, and so that's the biggest area that you see difference when different people are reviewing or comparing them, in the way that they either measure brightness or how bright they can look. As the cooler or more blue that it comes from the factory, the more bright it will measure and look. Now, the particular one that I'm reviewing happened to be very close to the white point that I use that is perceptually matched to D65. So that's one of the very good points about it, is that at least one of the white points it can come at is very natural looking and correct. Now, here's something I want to point out when it comes to HDR highlights. As you saw, that sun in that image was very blown out. Well, if you turn off the tone mapping, you can see the sun in this scene. However, when you have tone mapping turned off, it greatly reduces the brightness potential of the TV, so you really should have it in gradation preferred, and it does tone map a wider range. However, it does, as you can see, kind of blow out some of the highlights, and that has to do with the way the EOTF tracks and how it rolls off towards the top instead of making a sharp clipping point. So, just something to keep in mind. And I will talk about that more and show that more compared to the G2 when I do that comparison, how the sun image, the detail around that sun is visible on the LG, but it's not on the Sony. And then if you go to brightness preferred, what that does is it actually lowers the range of the tone mapping ability, cutting it from around 2500 nits down to about 1800, but then it does lift your mid-range and over brightens everything that's not a highlight and it doesn't actually make any of the HDR highlights any brighter. Alright, so now on this test, I'm going to test for gradients, and you can see how with smooth gradation to off with 10-bit material, it actually is quite smooth, and setting it to low really is enough to make it where it's pretty much you're not going to have any problems with gradients in any content. Even in 4K 120Hz HDR gaming, I've noticed setting it to low, you really don't see any posterization or color banding. Now moving on to reality creation and sharpness and detail. What I can tell you is if you were to use the graphics picture mode and turn all of the processing off, that will give you the actual sharpest, most native detail that you can get on the TV. However, if you are in a normal, say custom or cinema picture mode, and you want to use reality creation, just know that you want to use it mildly. As you can see, as you turn it up, the amount of artifacts that you get goes up as you turn up that slider. Basically, anything above 30 really starts to implement artifacts that are noticeable, and really I would just suggest leaving at the default 20, or better yet, just put on auto, as auto actually does a pretty good job of turning it off or making it very minor when it's a very clean source and it's native 4K content. Now, when it comes to the sharpness setting, that should be at default 50. That is the neutral setting. Some of the picture modes has it higher. Just always set it to 50 so there's no over sharpening, which can cause haloing and artifacts around edges. Alright, so with that out of the way, the sharpness and detail on Sony TVs is very good. The upscaling is very good. There are some artifacts, it's not perfect, and there's also your personal preference on how much smoothing / artificial sharpness / many different things that can be done with processing and upscaling. The more of that you add, the more side effects there are, such as having flickering objects, haloing around edges, detail being removed or deleted, things like that. So use it sparingly. Sony actually does a really good job if you just set all this stuff at auto, or you can even just leave it off and its native performance is very good as well. Alright, now we come to motion. This is definitely personal preference. However, I'm going to just show how the artifacts look with certain settings and how smooth it can look with and without artifacts depending on how you have it set up. So it's a little bit complicated, but do know, so smoothness is your motion interpolation setting. You have the option of minimum, 1, 2, and max. Motion flow is your overall setting. You have to set that to custom to be able to set smoothness to your own value. Now, a lot of people will find that smoothness at 1 offers a little bit of smoothing without much noticeable soap opera effect. However, this does have a direct correlation to the Cinemotion setting. So Cinemotion setting can either be off, low, or high. If you have that on high, then smoothness at 1 will have noticeable soap opera effect. However, there will be less artifacts and it will be cleaner. If you set Cinemotion to low or off, then smoothness at 1 won't really have noticeable soap opera effect, but there will be some artifacts. This is the difference between Sony and LG Motion. Now, LG does have a 1 through 10 de-judder setting, however, there's also 3 presets. So if you were to compare those 3 presets to the smoothness setting being at 1, 2, and max, you would find that they are all identical when Cinemotion is set to high. That's the difference. The Sony lets you adjust that Cinemotion setting versus LG does not, where its cinema screen setting is locked as soon as you go to the True Motion, which is how you adjust any of the smoothness settings. So on the Sony, you have the option of increased smoothness, but with artifacts, versus on the LG, where they don't really give you that option, they just don't want you to have the artifacts. So I will be showing more of that in the LG comparison video that will be coming soon. For right now, though, I will show a little bit of that with gaming, just to show how in Sdr Gaming, which is what Fortnite on the Xbox is, it's Sdr, the brightness between them is more or less the same, because they start out around the same. Now this is with the Sony at peak luminance medium. You could turn it to high and then it would be a little bit brighter. However, with the ASBL or logo detection not being able to be turned off on the Sony, then once it starts dimming, it's much more noticeable. So it's recommended when you're playing to have the peak luminance at medium, and then your brightness can be at max. On the LG, it's just max brightness. There is no peak brightness setting that's adjustable in game mode. Now they're both roughly around 230 nits or so to start on a 10% window, but as you saw there at the end of that little clip, after approximately 3 to 4 minutes in the game, the Sony had dimmed down to be darker than the LG. Now here in Dolby Vision or HDR bright content, you can see how the A80K actually does a pretty good job at keeping up with the G2. However, the G2 is brighter, especially in high APL scenes. Both of these TVs are not calibrated, they're just set to the same white point so that they look the same on the camera and to see their actual differences. And other than that, it's all about color differences and brightness differences between them. And again, we're going to get really in depth with that with the comparison, but do know that a very large portion of the time, they're going to look nearly identical because the content itself has to go beyond the limits of the A80K before the G2 would show its advantage or any other brighter TV. All right, now on to the best reason to pick the Sony or any Sony, and that is Sony has the best picture modes as far as accuracy is concerned out of the box without having to change settings. This is important as very few people will change settings. Some of them, or a lot of them, won't even change the picture mode. So if you're at least someone who's willing to change the picture mode, all you got to know is change it to custom picture mode on SDR and HDR content and Dolby Vision Dark for Dolby Vision, and you're done. Like, there's not really anything else that you have to change that isn't personal preference like motion settings. Whereas on LG, even though they have very good picture modes, the problem is they're starting to have it where like dynamic tone mapping is turned on by default on even Filmmaker, or it's cinema mode when it shouldn't be. Things like that. So there are some settings that will have to be adjusted on an LG in order for it to be in its most accurate state, whereas the Sony, you could just set it to custom and be done. Also, the Sony uses Google TV, which is my personal favorite OS system for the smart TVs. It's very easy to get set up. It lets you disable all the eco settings during that setup process and doesn't hide it from you, so that you don't have to worry about it reducing the brightness behind the scenes without you knowing. And also the remote. The remote is fantastic. I love the Sony remote this year. I originally thought I was going to be a little turned away because there's so many less buttons, but it turns out it's actually great. It's a great size. There's enough buttons. It doesn't cut away things like input or settings, and it seemed just right. And especially if you get the Master Series one that's backlit and has the brushed aluminum cover, that one's really nice. So there are other small quality of life things like that that a lot of people really appreciate. CEC, for example, I've never had CEC issues on the Sony with my personal receiver or streaming boxes, where I can just press power using the Sony remote and then the receiver turns on and then my NVIDIA Shield turns on and everything is just ready to go with one button press. That's kind of a rarity these days with other brands. Alright, so in a few months, when the A80J is out of stock and the A80K has come down in price, it's going to be a fantastic option for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. However, its biggest hurdle to climb is that the LG C2 costs less and gets brighter. Not to mention being the better gaming TV. So that's going to be a concern for quite a lot of buyers, and also the fact that LG has caught up in most aspects of processing now. It really can be a bit harder to recommend this year than it was to recommend the A80J over the C1 last year. And that's coming from someone who owned the 77-inch A80J and said last year that it was my favorite all-around TV to recommend to most people. So this year, LG really made strides, and Sony kind of took a smaller step and, again, kind of, in a way, backpedaled a little bit, at least compared to the 77-inch size of the A80J or some of the later ones that more consistently had the newer panels. So, best advice right now, if you watch this early and there's still A80Js in stock and they're substantially cheaper, I would definitely pick one of them. In my previous video to this with the setup, I did talk about how this year the A80K black frame insertion or clearness setting was changed so that it's now either on or off, and it's only with 60 Hz content, so that's also another step back compared to having multiple options for it previously. Now, I do think that has more to do with the panels itself, as LG did the same thing this year. However, compared to the A80J, it's another small thing that some people may want. Alright, so that's pretty much going to cover it for the review. It's a fantastic TV in a very competitive segment that is going to have some fierce competition from the C2 and its predecessor. Other than that, it really is still great. So I will have more videos, like I said, comparing with the G2, and then I will have a settings video. So if you aren't subscribed, subscribe for those, and that's it. So I hope you all have a good one. I hope you enjoyed it and it helped you out, and I will catch you in the next one.